The silk rustled like autumn leaves as Madison turned away from the mirror, her fingers tracing the tiny tag sewn into the seam. "Made by me," it whispered against her skin. In the hotel lobby, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, and somewhere behind her, Jessica's voice cut through the air like broken glass. "Look who actually showed up. Still wearing bargain bin clothes, I see." My throat closed. My hands found the familiar tremor that had followed me through 25 years of nights like this. Jessica's laugh echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sharp and practiced. I was the girl who'd sat alone at lunch every day for 4 years. The one they'd forgotten existed until they needed someone to remind themselves they mattered. Before we begin, if you enjoy true and exciting stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Write in the comments what city or country you are watching from. Now, let's get to the beginning of this story. Pinewood High had been a temple of unspoken hierarchies, where success was measured in designer handbags and weekend invitations that never came my way. The hallway smelled of industrial floor wax and teenage desperation, fluorescent lights humming overhead like trapped insects. I'd learned to navigate those corridors like a ghost, slipping between lockers and conversations that died when I approached. The cafeteria had been my daily purgatory, a vast room of round tables where belonging was currency I couldn't afford. I'd watched Jessica and her circle claim their throne near the windows, their laughter bright as sword strikes. They wore confidence like expensive perfume, something I could smell but never touch. My homemade sandwiches felt like evidence of everything I wasn't. Their organic salads and bottled water, a language I'd never learned to speak. At home, my mother's sewing machine hummed through thin walls, her fingers dancing over fabric scraps late into the night. She'd turn polyester into something that almost looked like the clothes I saw in magazines, her love stitched into every seam. But I knew the difference. In the harsh light of high school, love couldn't compete with labels, and handmade meant homemade, which meant poor, which meant invisible. The worst part wasn't their cruelty, it was their indifference. Cruelty would have meant I mattered enough to hate. Instead, I existed in the spaces between their thoughts, a shadow they stepped around without noticing. Until senior year, when Jessica decided my existence was worth acknowledging, just long enough to remind everyone why some people deserved to disappear. The comments started like paper cuts, small and stinging. "Nice dress," Jessica would say, her voice honey over broken glass. "Did your mom make it?" Her friends would giggle, the sound skittering across my skin like cold rain. They knew the answer. Everyone knew my mother worked double shifts at the factory and came home to her sewing machine, creating my wardrobe from remnants and dreams. I'd started avoiding the main hallway, taking the long route past the library where silence felt safer than their whispered observations. But shame followed me everywhere, settling into my shoulders like a winter coat I couldn't take off. I'd catch myself checking mirror reflections, searching for whatever flaw they saw so clearly, the one that marked me as different, as less than. The sewing machine's rhythm became my heartbeat that year. My mother's patience stretched thin as thread. She'd hold pins between her lips, her eyes focused on transforming nothing into something beautiful. "Fashion is art," she'd tell me, smoothing fabric across her lap. "And art doesn't need permission to exist." But permission was exactly what I thought I needed. Permission to take up space, to matter, to be seen as something other than a project for their charity or their cruelty. By spring, I'd perfected the art of invisibility, of shrinking myself small enough to slip through the cracks of their attention. The dress I wore to prom had taken my mother 3 weeks to complete, every bead sewn by hand, every seam pressed with care. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever owned, and the most painful to wear. Beauty felt dangerous when you weren't supposed to possess it. Senior week arrived like a storm I'd been watching from a distance, knowing it would wash over me whether I was ready or not. The incident happened on a Tuesday, in the parking lot where everyone gathered after school like vultures circling something wounded. Jessica had been holding court near her car, her voice carrying across the asphalt with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. "At least some of us won't have to pretend to be successful at the reunion," she'd said, her eyes finding mine across the parking lot. Her friends laughed, the sound sharp as breaking bottles. "Some people are born to serve others. It's not their fault they can't rise above what they are." The words hit me like ice water, shocking in their casual cruelty. Around me, the parking lot seemed to hold its breath, everyone waiting to see if I'd finally break or simply disappear like I always did. The asphalt beneath my feet felt molten, the late afternoon sun pressing against my skin like judgment. I'd opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, to claim some small piece of dignity, but no words came. They never did. That night, I'd stood in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the dreams I'd been too afraid to voice and the plans I'd been too small to make. The silence felt different then, not empty, but full of possibility I'd never allowed myself to imagine. My mother found me there hours later, her hands still smelling of the fabric softener she used to make our clothes feel like luxuries. "The girl who apologizes for breathing," she'd said, her voice gentle as morning light, "died today. Tomorrow, you become who you were always meant to be." The decision had crystallized like ice forming on a window, beautiful and inevitable. I'd withdrawn from the local community college where I'd planned to study business, using the money I'd saved for something else entirely. The Parsons School of Design seemed impossible, a place where dreams went to either flourish or die spectacular deaths. But impossible felt safer than certain failure. At least if I reached for something beyond my grasp, I wouldn't have to wonder what might have been. My brother Marcus had been the one to believe in me first, his faith unwavering even when mine crumbled like dry leaves. He'd driven me to New York in his beat-up Honda, the back seat packed with everything I owned and hope I couldn't quite trust. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to become someone else," he'd said as Manhattan's skyline rose before us like a promise. "You just need to remember who you always were." Fashion school had been a revelation and a reckoning, a place where my mother's lessons finally found their purpose. The other students came with trust funds and connections, but I came with calloused fingers that knew the weight of fabric and eyes that could see beauty in scraps others discarded. Slowly, painfully, I'd learned that being different wasn't a flaw to hide, but a strength to cultivate. My designs carried stories the others couldn't tell, stories of making something beautiful from nothing, of dignity stitched together with determination. By graduation, the girl who'd hidden in corners had evolved into something else entirely. My final collection had been featured in Vogue, photographed by artists who understood that true luxury came not from price tags, but from the hands that created it. The quiet girl who'd sewn her worth into every seam had become Madison Clark, a name whispered in the same breath as emerging talents and future legends. Success had been the best revenge, but it had also been the best medicine. For the first time in my life, I'd mattered because of what I could create, not despite what I lacked. Years passed like pages turning, each one adding another layer to the person I was becoming. My boutique in Soho drew clients who appreciated artistry over artifice, women who understood that true elegance came from wearing something that told their story. My mother's sewing machine had found a place of honor in my studio, its familiar rhythm now accompanied by a team of seamstresses who shared my vision of fashion as rebellion disguised as beauty. Marcus had become my business partner, his faith in me justified by profit margins and magazine covers that featured my work. We'd built something together that honored where we came from while reaching toward everything we dreamed of becoming. The girl who'd been invisible had learned to command attention, not through loudness, but through the quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth. Every dress I created carried a piece of that transformation, a whisper of possibility for women who'd forgotten they deserved beautiful things. The reunion invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from my childhood address where my mother still lived in the same house where dreams had been sewn together with second-hand thread. 20 years felt like a lifetime and an instant. the paper heavy in my hands as I'd considered whether the person I'd become was ready to face the ghosts of who I'd been. The decision hadn't been about proving anything to them. It had been about proving everything to myself. Marcus had driven up from the city with me, his presence a reminder that I'd never again have to face my past alone. The dress I'd chosen was silk in midnight blue, cut with architectural precision, but sewn with the same love my mother had taught me to recognize. Hidden in the seam, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a tag that read, "Made by me." Not a designer label, but a declaration of independence, a reminder that I'd created not just the dress, but the woman wearing it. The hotel ballroom sparkled with the kind of orchestrated nostalgia that made the past feel softer than it had been. Classmates I barely remembered had grown into versions of themselves I wouldn't have recognized, their faces bearing the weight of choices and chances that had shaped them. I'd moved through the crowd with the grace I'd learned in boardrooms and fashion shows, my confidence earned through years of proving myself in rooms where I didn't belong. Jessica had aged beautifully, her success written in designer clothes and careful makeup that spoke of maintenance rather than transformation. She'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, the kind of existence I'd once envied from a distance. But watching her hold court near the bar, surrounded by the same circle that had defined her in high school, I'd realized that some people peaked at 18 and spent the rest of their lives trying to recreate that moment of absolute power. When our eyes met across the room, I'd seen the flicker of recognition followed by confusion. The girl she remembered couldn't possibly be the woman standing before her, confidence worn like the silk dress that caught the light with every movement. Her smile had been automatic, practiced, the same one she'd used to dismiss me 20 years ago. But this time, dismissal required effort she hadn't expected to expend. "Madison?" she'd said, my name a question mark in her mouth. "I almost didn't recognize you." "People change," I'd replied, my voice carrying the weight of every night I'd cried myself to sleep and every morning I'd decided to keep fighting. Some more than others. The conversation that followed had been a dance of recognition and revelation, her questions probing for the cracks that had once defined me. But those cracks had been filled with gold, Kintsukuroi style, making me stronger in the broken places. When she'd asked about my work, I'd told her simply that I designed clothes for women who wanted to feel beautiful. I hadn't mentioned the magazine covers, or the celebrity clients, or the boutique that drew waiting lists longer than her attention span. The success spoke for itself in the way I moved, the way I listened, the way I no longer needed her approval to feel worthy of existence. As the evening progressed, I'd watched her navigate the room with decreasing confidence, her realm of influence smaller than she remembered. The classmates who'd once hung on her every word had scattered to their own lives, their own accomplishments, their own definitions of success that didn't require her validation. 20 years had revealed the truth that time always tells, that high school hierarchies were just dress rehearsal for real life, and some people never learned their lines for the actual performance. The moment that mattered most had come near the end of the evening when she'd cornered me by the coat check with the desperation of someone watching their world shift beneath their feet. "You always were lucky," she'd said, the words sharp with the bitterness of someone who'd confused cruelty with strength. "Some people just get handed everything." I'd looked at her then with the compassion I'd learned through years of therapy and self-discovery, seeing her clearly for the first time. "Jessica," I'd said, my voice gentle but firm, "I wasn't handed anything. I made it. All of it. Including the person I became after you tried to convince me I was nothing." The silence that followed had been different from the silences of our youth, not empty, but full of understanding that some bridges burned beyond repair. But destruction could be its own kind of creation, clearing space for something better to grow. I'd left her standing by the coat check, still beautiful, still successful in her own right, but suddenly small in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the space her spirit occupied. The drive home had been quiet, Marcus understanding that some victories needed to be savored in silence. The city lights had welcomed me back like an old friend. each illuminated window a reminder that I'd built a life beyond the narrow definitions of a small town's imagination. The dress hung in my closet now, a reminder not of revenge, but of resurrection. Proof that sometimes the best response to those who try to diminish you is simply to become magnificent. In my studio the next morning, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples and the dreams of women who trusted me to help them tell their stories, I'd sewn a new tag. Not made by me, but made by us. Recognition that transformation was never a solo journey, but a collaboration between the person you were and the person you chose to become. The girl who'd been mocked had grown into a woman who understood that true power came not from tearing others down, but from building yourself up, stitch by careful stitch, until you became someone even your younger self would admire. And you? What do you think? Did she do the right thing? What would you have done in her place? If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us what you thought in the comments. Your support is what helps us continue bringing you exciting stories like this one. Now watch other stories on screen. We'll see you next time, with love and respect.